The document arrived at 0600 station time, delivered by a drone that appeared out of nowhere and then disappeared just as fast. Director Asha Ven was on her second cup of coffee when her assistant knocked on her office door and slid a data pad across her desk without saying a word. Her assistant had a talent for that, delivering bad news quietly, as if the quietness would make the news smaller. The data pad glowed softly. Asha picked it up. She read the first paragraph. Then she put her coffee down. Then she read the first paragraph again. It was a declaration of war, not the kind she had ever imagined. Not a broadcast over emergency channels, not a flash of light outside the station windows, not the screech of proximity alarms. It was a document, 17 clauses, headers and subheadings. A footnotes referencing previous agreements she had never heard of. The Vreth seal of honorable engagement, which apparently existed, was stamped in the top right corner, glowing faintly gold against the white background. Clause 1 named the dates of the conflict. Start date, 3 weeks from today. End date, open, pending an acceptable losses threshold defined in Clause 11. Clause 3 specified the engagement coordinates, a stretch of dead space called Grid 7, 40 million kilometers from the nearest inhabited body. Clause 9 listed protected infrastructure. Clause 14 outlined ceasefire communication protocols. Clause 17 was an appendix of definitions. There was a table of contents. The declaration of war had a table of contents. Asha read it twice, front to back. She sat very still when she was done. Outside her window, Kepler 7 station hummed its normal hum. Cargo drones crossing the dock. Shift workers heading to the lower levels. A child running down the corridor outside, chased by another child, both of them laughing about something that had nothing to do with any of this. She picked up her communicator. "Get me Admiral Carr," she said. "I don't care what time it is at Fleet Command." Admiral Jonah Carr read the document at 0900 Earth Standard Time, in an office that smelled of old coffee and the particular kind of tiredness that comes from 30 years of solving problems no one else wanted to look at. He read it once, passed it to his legal team. His legal team read it and passed it to the xenolinguist. The xenolinguist confirmed that the document was exactly what it appeared to be. A formal, carefully structured, cross-referenced declaration of war from a species called the Vreth Dominion, who had apparently been running their wars this way for 6,000 years and saw no reason to change. The lead xenolinguist, Dr. Priya Mehta, put the file down and looked at Carr across the conference table. "They're telling us exactly where they want to fight," she said. "I see that. And when?" "Yes. And what they won't hit." "Mm-hmm." There was a pause in the room. The kind of pause that happens when a group of people all arrive at the same place at the same time, and nobody wants to say it out loud first. Dr. Mehta said it. "Admiral, they've sent us their entire list of limitations in writing." Carr leaned back in his chair. It made a sound like a complaint. He looked at the document again. All 17 clauses. The footnotes, the table of contents, the careful, detailed map of everything the Vreth considered off-limits and everything they considered acceptable, and the very precise geography of where they expected this war to live and breathe and stay. He thought about the 3 fuel depots running supply chains to the contested frontier. He thought about the Vreth communication relays he'd had his eye on for 2 months. He thought about the automated resupply chains feeding their forward positions, running through systems that Clause 9 had very helpfully confirmed were protected. He picked up his communicator. "Draft a response, will your eye," he said. "One word. Acknowledged. Full stop. Send it." The response arrived at Vreth High Command 17 hours later. High Marshal Sethran Val received it personally. He had been the commanding officer of the Dominion's 7th Expansion Fleet for 12 years. He had fought 3 declared wars against 2 different species. He had won 2 of them and negotiated an honorable draw on the 3rd. He was a man of great experience and patience. He read the human response. He read it again. Acknowledged. That was all. He placed the data pad on the conference table in front of his senior staff. "They've accepted term," he said. War strategist Keth looked at the message, then at the marshal, then back at the message. "There's no counter clause on the engagement coordinates," Keth said. "A minor point. They'll confirm details through proper channels." They haven't requested a compact arbitration contact. They're new to this. There will be process gaps. Keth was quiet, and he had a long face that had been trained over decades of service to show nothing. But something moved behind his eyes. "Sir," he said carefully, "should we request clarification?" Val looked at him. "We've sent a formal declaration. They've acknowledged it. The process is complete." "Yes, sir." "We proceed to preparation phase." "Yes, sir." The meeting ended. The staff filed out. Keth was last. He stopped at the doorway and looked back at the message still glowing on the datapad. One word. He thought about it on the walk back to his own office. He thought about the 17 clauses they'd sent, the care and detail in every line, the specific, generous, clear information they had provided to their enemy about the shape and limits of the coming war. He thought about the humans reading all of it, responding with a single word. He sat at his desk and opened the Dominion's intelligence files on humanity. Thin files. Humanity was a young spacefaring civilization. They had only recently pushed into Vreth-contested territory. They hadn't signed the compact. The Vreth had noted this without concern, since non-signatory species typically aligned their conduct with compact norms once conflict became imminent. It was simply what civilized species did. Keth scrolled through what they had. Population data, expansion records, economic structure. He found the military history section. It was bigger than he expected. He opened it. He read for 20 minutes. Then he closed it. He opened it again and read for another hour. When he was done, he sat very still in his chair and looked at the wall across from him. The wall was gray and said nothing helpful. Keth had a habit of writing notes when something bothered him. Private notes kept separate from official records. He opened his personal log and typed 3 words. "We should ask." Then he sat with it for a while longer. Then he closed the log without sending anything to anyone, because the marshal had already called the preparation phase and the process was complete. And Keth was a man who believed in process. He closed the file on human military history. He opened it again. He closed it. 3 weeks passed the way 3 weeks before a war always pass. Faster than they should, and full of the wrong kind of quiet. On Kepler 7, Director Asha Ven received the one-word response from Fleet Command, along with a follow-up message from Admiral Carr, marked Priority Actual. The follow-up was 4 paragraphs long. She read it twice. Then she started doing exactly what it told her to do, which involved moving several things to several places, none of which were Grid 7. On the Vreth Fleet flagship, High Marshal Val watched his forces come together with the satisfaction of a man who has done something complicated very well. His fleet was beautiful in formation, precise, every ship in its correct position, every weapon system set to the parameters allowed under Clause 6. Every commander briefed on the engagement rules and the ceasefire protocols, and the long list of infrastructure they would not touch. They were ready. They moved toward Grid 7 on schedule, at the right time, with the full strength of a civilization that had turned war into something close to ceremony. On the morning the Vreth fleet reached Grid 7, High Fleet Scholar Orith Vaughn was sitting in his study aboard the command vessel, reviewing the compact commentary he'd been asked to prepare for the post-conflict legal team. Orith was not a fighting man. He was, by training and by nature, a scholar. He had spent 40 years studying the laws of war across every compact signatory, how they developed, how they held, how they failed, and how they were repaired. He had been assigned to this fleet because conflicts with non-signatories required documentation, and documentation required someone who understood what was being documented. He was a careful man. He noticed things others did not bother to look for, which was why, at 700, when the fleet reached Grid 7 and held formation and waited, Orith looked up from his notes and checked the long-range scans. He checked them again. He flagged his assistant. "Run the scan on full range," he said. "Already running, Scholar. Full range, full spectrum." And his assistant was a young man named Vel, who had never seen combat and still had the look of someone who believed things would make sense if you looked at them carefully enough. "Nothing, sir," Vel said. "Nothing. No human vessels in grid range. No human vessels in adjacent sectors." Orith stood up slowly. He walked to the scan display. He looked at it the way a man looks at a door that should be locked and isn't. "Where are they?" he said, not to Vel, not to anyone, just out loud into the quiet, a question placed in the air and left there. The fleet held formation for 6 hours. The humans did not come. Orith went back to his desk. He picked up his notes on compact commentary. Harry set them back down. He opened the intelligence file on humanity, the same thin file Keth had opened 3 weeks earlier, and began with the slow attention of a man who suspects he has missed something important, to read. He got 40 minutes in before his communicator sounded. Emergency channel. Reports coming in from the frontier. Vreth Fuel Depot in Sector 9, hit. Systems down. Vreth Communication Relay at Point Heron, destroyed. Vreth Resupply Chain feeding Forward Base 3, disrupted. Forward Base 2, dark. Orith sat with the reports spread across his desk and did not move for a long time. He read them in order. Sector 9, Point Heron, Forward Base 3, Forward Base 2. Every single target was listed in Clause 9, every single one. Protected infrastructure, non-combatant supply systems. Exempt from engagement under the terms of the compact that the humans had not signed, had not been asked to sign, and had apparently never read. He opened the intelligence file again. He started over from the beginning. This time he read all the way to the end. That night, in his private log, Orith Vaughn wrote 4 sentences. I have been studying the laws of war for 40 years. I have assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that those laws describe something universal. I am no longer certain this is true. I am going to need to think about this carefully. He saved the log, closed it, sat in the dark for a while. Outside the viewport, Grid 7 floated empty and untouched and completely irrelevant, exactly as the humans had decided it would be. The reports kept coming. Orith Vaughn read them one by one, out in the order they arrived, which was also the order in which things had stopped working across 4 Vreth-controlled sectors. He spread them across his desk like a man laying out a puzzle he didn't want to finish. Sector 9 Fuel Depot, offline. 60% of the fuel reserve destroyed in a strike so fast the automated defense systems hadn't finished cycling when it was already over. Point Heron Communication Relay, gone. Not damaged, gone. The human strike team had removed it with a kind of clean precision that suggested they had spent a great deal of time thinking about exactly where to hit it and in what order. Forward Base 3, running on reserve power. Maybe 3 weeks before the base commander would have to make uncomfortable decisions about what to keep running and what to turn off. Forward Base 2, dark, no signal. When no response to hails. 42 personnel. Orith read that last line twice. He flagged his assistant. Velj, Forward Base 2, 42 personnel. Vel was already checking. Forward Base 2 had been evacuated 4 days prior, sir, per standard compact protocol during declared conflict periods. The base was empty. Orith nodded slowly. He hadn't known that. He checked the compact. Clause 14. Yes, there it was. Non-combatant personnel were to be evacuated from forward positions within 72 hours of a declaration receipt. The humans had sent no acknowledgement of this clause. The Dominion had assumed, reasonably, that an unacknowledged clause was one the other party simply hadn't gotten around to confirming yet. It had not occurred to anyone that the humans might have cleared the base, not because of Clause 14, but because they had been planning to destroy it themselves. Orith wrote this down. He wrote down a great many things that morning. He had 6 pages of notes by the time the fleet officially left Grid 7 and began moving to assess the damage. The notes were careful and precise and completely failed to add up to anything that made sense under the framework he had used his entire career. High Marshal Vall was not happy. This was an understatement. The Marshal was the kind of unhappy that happens when a capable man discovers that the rules of the game changed while he was playing it perfectly. He stood in the fleet command room looking at the damage reports with an expression that had moved past anger into something quieter and colder. They violated 9 separate compact clauses, Val said. 12, Keth said. Air from across the room. Flat. He had been flat all morning. I counted 12. Find their fleet and engage them at Grid 7 as planned. Sir? A very small pause. We don't know where their fleet is. The room was quiet. What do you mean we don't know? They have no formation. No identifiable fleet grouping. The strike teams appear to be operating independently across multiple sectors. Long-range scans show individual human vessels spread across a 40 light-year radius. None of them are near Grid 7. None of them are moving in any coordinated pattern. A longer pause. That's not how a fleet operates, Vale said. No, sir. That's not how anything operates. Keth said nothing. Orth, sitting in the corner with his notes, here thought, that's how a species operates when it has been fighting wars for 10,000 years, and no one told it there was supposed to be a different way. He didn't say this out loud. It wasn't his place. He watched the marshal turn back to the display screens, noted the exact moment when Vale's certainty developed a crack. Small, barely visible, like a hairline fracture in something that had always looked solid. And then he went back to his desk and kept reading. The intelligence files on humanity were thin in some places and unexpectedly deep in others. The early sections were standard. Demographic data, expansion timelines, technology assessments, first contact records. Orth moved through it at a steady pace. Then he reached the military history section. He had looked at this briefly the night before and noticed it was large. Now, reading with a specific question to answer, he understood that large was not the right word. It was enormous. Humanity had been fighting documented, recorded, analyzed wars for approximately 10,000 years. The early records were incomplete, but what existed painted a picture so dense and detailed that Orth felt, somewhere around the second hour of reading, a feeling he could not name immediately. He named it eventually. It was the feeling of looking down from a very high place. Every weapon the humans had used in this conflict, they had used on each other first. Every tactic, the precise infrastructure strikes, the supply chain disruptions, what the coordinated independent teams operating without a central formation, all of it existed in human military writing, not because humans had invented it against the Freth, but because they had invented it against themselves. The earliest recorded use of coordinated infrastructure disruption as a primary war tactic was dated approximately 8,000 years before humanity left their home planet. 8,000 years. The Vreth Compact was 6,000 years old. It was considered ancient. It was the foundation of civilized warfare across 12 spacefaring species. Humanity had been hitting each other's supply lines 2,000 years before the Compact existed. Orth had requested the intercepted communication logs from the human strike teams, and he had hoped to find strategy, a deliberate decision to violate Compact terms as a calculated move, something he could document, something that fit into an existing framework. The logs were ordinary. Team 7, Sector 9, depot hit, primary target down, heading back to rally point. Hendricks wants to know if we're doing hot food tonight or rations again. Team 4, Point Heron. Relay gone, clean exit, 3 minutes under schedule. Good work. Does anyone know if the medic cleared Russo for duty? She's been grounded a week. Team 11, Forward Base 2. Base confirmed empty. It was already clear when we got there. Moving to secondary target. Martinez keeps asking about leave rotation. I said I'd pass it up. Orth read the logs 3 times. He read them looking for the thing he expected to find. A note about Compact terms. A reference to the rules they were breaking. A recorded decision, somewhere, to ignore the document they'd been sent. There was nothing. Not because it had been hidden, not because human commanders had been careful to keep it out of the logs, because the decision had never been made. There had been no moment where a human officer had weighed the Compact terms and chosen to discard them. The strikes had been planned and carried out by people who did not know the rules existed and who had therefore not broken them on purpose, and who were currently, somewhere between questions about food and leave rotation, doing it again in Sector 12. Orth sat with this for a long time. He had a word for what he was feeling. He had encountered it once before, years ago, reading about a dead civilization that had collapsed not from outside attack, but from the slow internal failure of every system built to keep it stable. He had felt it reading about the moment those people must have realized their walls weren't walls anymore. The word was vertigo. The damage assessments were completed by day 3. Keth presented them to the marshal with the face of a man delivering news that is worse than expected, but not, somehow, surprising. 2 fuel depots offline, The communication relay network in the outer sectors running at 40%. 3 forward bases below full capacity. Supply chains to the contested frontier disrupted enough to push the fleet's operational timeline back 3 to 4 weeks. Not catastrophic, but not small. And it had all happened in the first 72 hours, when before the Vreth fleet had fired a single shot against targets every commander in the room had been completely certain were protected. "We need to locate their fleet and force a conventional engagement," Vale said. "We're working on it," Keth said. "How long?" Keth looked at the display. 40 vessels scattered across a 40-light-year radius, none of them moving in any pattern his strategist could track. "Our models are built for fleet formations," he said. "Predictable movement, concentration points. Human deployment doesn't cluster. Our models keep looking for the center and there isn't one." Vale looked at him. "There is always a center." "Not for them." A silence stretched across the room. Orith, in his corner, kept his eyes on his notes. He had found deep in the human military history files a term asymmetric warfare. The humans had a name for it. They had named it because they had been practicing it against each other long enough to study it and write papers about it and develop counter strategies that had then been countered themselves. There was an entire body of human academic writing dedicated to fighting without a center. He wrote this down. On day 5, Keith came to Orith's study rather than to the marshal. This was unusual. Keth was not a man who sought out scholars. He came in, stood at the edge of the room, and looked at the wall of notes Orith had been building for 5 days. "They're not reading our terms for gaps," Keth said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't think so," Orith said. "I think they're simply hitting what seems useful to hit. The gaps are something they fell through, not something they aim for." Keth was quiet. "That's worse," he said. "Yes," Orith said. "It is." Keth left. Orith added a line to his notes. "They are not working around the compact. They don't know the compact exists. Every compact violation in this conflict is, from their perspective, simply a correct military decision. They are not malicious. They are experienced. More experienced than any living species, possibly at the specific work of finding and removing the things that make an enemy function." He paused. "They learn this from each other. I need to understand why." On day 7, he finished reading the human military history files and sat with what he had found. 10,000 years of war. Weapon after weapon, tactic after tactic. Doctrine laid over doctrine in layers. And each one a response to what the last war had taught. The scale of it was not what stopped him. What stopped him was something else. The attempts to limit it. There had been many treaties, agreements, laws of war, built and signed and broken and rebuilt. An entire structure of human effort, raised across centuries, trying to put a shape around something that kept going shapeless. Buried in a footnote in the mid-period section on Earth conflict law, he found a reference to something called the Geneva Conventions. He pulled the full document and read it. He sat very still. He read it again. It was a compact. Rougher than the Vreth version, older, less precise in places. But it was, without question, an attempt to do exactly what the Vreth Compact did. To draw a line around war. To say this far and no further. Humanity had built it themselves, not under pressure from a coalition, not because a more advanced civilization handed it down. They had looked at what they were doing to each other and tried from inside to make it smaller. Then kept breaking it. Then built a new version. 3 major revisions in 2 centuries. Each one patching the holes that the previous war had torn open. Orth looked at this pattern for a long time. He thought about the one-word response sitting at the top of the Dominion's communication log. Acknowledged. He had spent a week assuming the humans had known what the compact was and chosen to ignore it. He had been wrong. They hadn't ignored it. They had never seen it. And they had been doing this to each other. This exact thing, this relentless, practical, an entirely unceremonious form of war. For 10,000 years before anyone thought to invite them into the conversation about how war was supposed to work. He picked up his communicator. "Vel," he said, "Sir, pull me everything we have on human conflict law. Treaties, conventions, all of it." Vel started pulling. He worked for a few minutes in silence. "Sir," he said finally, "there's quite a lot." "I know," Orith said. He had known since the first footnote. He started reading. The silence protocol had ended the last war the Freth fought in 11 days. High Marshal Val had not wanted to use it this early. It was a significant weapon. Not in the explosive sense, not in the sense of fire and rubble, but significant the way a very loud statement in the middle of a quiet conversation is significant. It changed the shape of everything that came after it. But the frontier was bleeding, and the humans were somewhere he couldn't locate, and he needed this war to find its proper form before the losses went any deeper. He authorized the protocol on day 12. The silence protocol targeted the neuroelectric systems of organic personnel within a set combat zone. Clean, precise, no structural damage. Affected personnel lost consciousness for 6 to 12 hours. When they woke, they were unharmed. Confused, but unharmed. Within compact terms, it was one of the most humane weapons the Dominion had ever built. Against the Thalari Confederacy, the protocol had ended a war in the time it took their High Council to finish reading the damage assessments. They signed ceasefire terms 6 days later. Only the shared understanding was immediate. This weapon could be used anywhere, at any time, against anyone. Resistance wasn't only difficult, it was biologically pointless. The Vreth fleet deployed the protocol against the 3 human positions they had managed to locate on the morning of day 12 at 0600 hours. By 0800, the first reports were coming in. By 1000, the picture was complete. 2 of the 3 positions had been empty before the protocol hit. The humans had moved. Not in response to the protocol. They had no warning it was coming. They had simply moved because moving appeared to be a natural state for human strike teams, who did not hold fixed positions the way organized military units were supposed to. The 3rd position had been hit successfully. 14 human personnel, unconscious, currently being retrieved. The Vreth looked at the results. They had deployed their most significant weapon. They had caught 14 people. The human response came over the next 48 hours. It did not come as a counterstrike, not as a fleet movement, not as a weapons test, not as anything Keth's models were built to track. It came as 11 things at the same time. 1. 3 Vreth economic agreements in neutral space received information packages containing detailed records of Vreth military spending in the conflict zone, cross-referenced with Dominion civilian infrastructure budgets. The packages reached Vreth colony world news networks at the same moment. 2. Supply routes feeding the Vreth forward positions received contamination traces in their automated cargo streams. Non-lethal, but detectable enough to require full decontamination, holds on 17 separate cargo vessels, each delayed by 11 days. 3. 4 Vreth outpost commanders received communication packages that appeared to come from Dominion High Command, containing orders that contradicted each other. 2 commanders attempted to follow the orders before the forgeries were discovered. One of them moved his entire unit to the wrong sector. 4 through 11. Orith stopped tracking specific incidents and started writing categories. He wrote for 3 hours, 12 pages of notes, cross-references, and a growing list of what the humans were doing that he recognized. Not from Freth military doctrine, but from the human conflict literature he had been reading for the past week. Psychological warfare, economic disruption, disinformation operations, supply contamination, false flag communication. Each tactic had its own name in human military writing, its own history, its own body of academic work studying when it worked, when it didn't, and how to defend against it. The Vreth had never developed counters to any of them because the compact prohibited them, and every compact signatory had simply not used them, and so there was nothing to defend against because there had never been a need. Orith looked at his 12 pages. He set them down. He thought about Keith saying, 11 days ago, "They're reading our terms for gaps." He had said he didn't think that was right. He was revising his opinion. The 14 captured human personnel were processed through standard compact prisoner protocol. They were housed in the medical wing, fed, were given access to personal communication channels, and treated exactly as Clause 13 required. One of them was Captain Dara Salas. Orth had asked for the interview himself. The marshal had agreed, not because he expected strategic value, but because Orth had been sitting in the corner of every command meeting for 2 weeks writing notes and saying nothing, and Vol had decided it was time to find out what was in those notes. Orth carried a data pad and his 12 pages of notes into the interview room and set them on the table. He also carried the particular feeling of a man who is about to ask a question he isn't entirely sure he wants answered. Solace was sitting at the table eating from a tray. She looked up when he came in. She was a small woman with a weathered face, the kind of face that had spent a lot of time in places where comfort was not the priority. Alert. Showing nothing she hadn't chosen to show. Orth sat down across from her. She waited. "Captain Solis," he said. "My name is Orth Vaughn. I'm the Dominion's fleet scholar on conflict law. I'd like to ask you some questions." "Okay," she said. "Not tactical questions. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here for military intelligence." She looked at him steadily. "Okay. I want to ask you about the compact." Something shifted in her face. Very slightly. A small adjustment behind the eyes. "What compact?" she said. Orth placed the data pad on the table. He had loaded the full compact document, all 17 clauses, all footnotes, all appendices. He slid it across. She picked it up. He read it. He watched her read. She took her time. She was reading carefully, not skimming. She set it back down. "Where did this come from?" she said. "It is the Pan-Galactic Compact on Honorable Conflict, signed by 12 spacefaring civilizations, including the Vreth Dominion, approximately 600 years ago. Every signatory has used it to govern armed conflict since its creation." Solace looked at the data pad again, then at him. "We don't have this," she said. "You were not invited to sign it," Orth said. "You were a pre-contact civilization at the time it was drafted. But it was assumed when you achieved spacefaring status that you would naturally align your conduct with compact norms." Solis was quiet for a moment. "Who assumed that?" "We did," Orth said. "All of us." She didn't say anything to that. Orth looked at his notes. He had been building toward this question for 2 weeks, and he wanted to ask it the right way. "Captain, during this conflict, your forces struck fuel infrastructure listed under Clause 9 as protected. Communication infrastructure protected under Clause 7. You deployed disinformation against military command structures. Clause 4 covers this explicitly. You contaminated supply networks under Clause 8's protection. I didn't know any of those clauses existed," Solis said. The room was quiet. "None of our briefings mentioned a compact," she said. "None of our planning was built around compact terms. We hit supply lines because supply lines win wars. We hit communications because cutting communications breaks coordination. We use disinformation because it works." A small pause. But we've been doing these things since before we had proper words for them." Orth had known this. He had read the files. He had spent 2 weeks building toward this exact confirmation. It was different hearing it said plainly by a small woman eating from a tray. "I understand," he said. "What I need to know, and my interest is scholarly, not accusatory, is this." He leaned forward slightly. "If you had been shown this document before the conflict began, if you had known the compact existed and understood its terms, would you have honored it?" Solis looked at him for a long time. She wasn't being careful with her answer. He had spent long enough studying people to know the difference between someone deciding what to say and someone actually thinking. She was actually thinking. "Parts of it," she said finally. "Some of it is reasonable. Protecting medical facilities, protecting civilian personnel, prisoner treatment." She tapped the data pad. "Some of it's fine." A pause. "Some of it," she said, "reads like it was written by people who wanted war to be safe for the people who started it." Orth said nothing. "Clause 9, she said. "You've listed your entire supply infrastructure as protected. That's not protecting civilians. That's protecting your ability to keep fighting. That's protecting the war itself." She met his eyes. "Someone wrote that clause and called it humanitarian." Orth looked down at his notes. He did not have anything to say to this. He excused himself from the room. He stood in the corridor outside for a long time, long enough for 2 of his staff to walk past and look at him with quiet concern. Need long enough for the ventilation system to cycle twice. Long enough to understand that what he was feeling was not the vertigo from before. The vertigo had been the discovery that the floor wasn't solid. This was the floor being gone entirely. And the understanding that he had been standing on the idea of the floor, and that the idea had held him up for 40 years, and that he was not sure now what was underneath it. He went back to his study. He opened his notes. He read through 12 pages of documented compact violations. Then he read Clause 9. Then Clauses 7 and 4 and 8. He sat with a question that had never occurred to him in 40 years of studying the laws of war. Who do these clauses actually protect? He wrote the question down. He did not write an answer. He wasn't sure he had one. That evening, when Keth came again to his study, he stood in the doorway and looked at Orth in the way that senior military men look at scholars when they want information but don't want to appear to need it. The disinformation campaign, Keth said. The outpost commanders who received false orders. Our security team traced the method. A pause. It wasn't sophisticated. It was simple. Very simple. The kind of technique we would have considered too basic to be a real threat. Yes, Orth said. It worked because we weren't looking for it. Yes, because no compact signatory uses it. Correct. Keth stood there for a moment. How long have the humans been using it? Orth checked his notes. The earliest documented instance in their military literature, he said, to us is approximately 7,000 years ago. The silence after this was a particular kind of silence. The kind that happens when a number is so large, it stops sounding like a number. 7,000, Keth said. Yes. We've had faster-than-light travel for 4,000 years. I know. Keth stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he left without another word. Orth went back to his notes. He added one line at the bottom of page 12, after everything else he had written. We were not outmaneuvered. We were simply the first compact signatory they encountered. Every technique they used against us, every one, they developed fighting each other, in wars we were not there to see. They did not adapt for us. They did not need to. They arrived at this conflict already knowing everything the compact was designed to prevent. He looked at what he had written. He added one more line. We need to talk to the rest of the galaxy. I suspect they know something we don't. High Marshal Val invoked the emergency clause on day 20. It was not a decision he made lightly. The emergency clause had been used twice in compact history. Once during the Thalari border crisis 40 years ago, once during a three-way territorial dispute in the outer systems a century before that. It was a tool of last resort. It said, formally and on record, that the invoking party needed help. Val was not a man who liked needing help, but three of his outpost commanders were still untangling the mess left by the disinformation campaign. His supply routes were running at reduced capacity. Once the forward bases were feeding off reserves, his strategists were running models that kept breaking because the models had no framework for an enemy that didn't concentrate, didn't form, didn't position for a conventional engagement, and was currently somewhere out in the dark of 4 separate star systems, still hitting things. He needed outside pressure. A coalition of compact signatories formally condemning humanity's conduct would create costs. It would give the humans a reason to come to the table. It was the correct next step. He sent formal requests to 7 civilizations. The responses came back within a standard week. Orth had asked to be the one who read them first, quietly without making a formal request. He had simply been standing near the Marshal's communications officer when the responses arrived and had said, and in a calm voice, that he would process them and present a summary to High Command. The Marshal had nodded, already looking at something else. Orth took the responses to his study. He read them alone. It took an hour. When he was done, he went to Vel's desk. I need tea, he said. Vel had never heard Orth ask for tea in his life. He went and got it without saying a word. The Shen Collective's response came first. The Shen were an old civilization, patient, careful, not given to excess in either feeling or language. Their response to the Vreth request for coalition support was 3 paragraphs. The first expressed sympathy with the Dominion's position, and to the second noted that the Shen had been aware of humanity's existence for approximately 40 years and had made a deliberate decision during that time not to initiate any armed conflict with them. The third contained one sentence: "We recommend clearly marking all supply infrastructure and providing humanity with a copy of the compact before proceeding further." The Thalari Confederacy's response was longer. The Thalari had faced the Silence Protocol and signed ceasefire terms in 6 days. They were a proud people. Signing those terms had cost them something they had spent the following decades trying to get back, mostly by building countermeasures against the protocol on the general principle that no weapon should catch them unprepared twice. Their response ran to 4 paragraphs. The first expressed sympathy. The second noted that the Thalari had, on 3 separate occasions over 40 years, seriously considered initiating contact and potential conflict with the human expansion zone. On each occasion, they had commissioned a strategic modeling review. The third summarized what those reviews had found: asymmetric response capacity that scaled without a clear ceiling, no measurable susceptibility to conventional deterrence, operational tempo that did not slow under pressure in the ways other species' militaries slowed. The third review, submitted 11 years ago, had included a summary recommendation: "We advise diplomatic resolution as the only strategically sound path forward." The fourth paragraph was a single sentence: "We hope this information is useful." The Oreth Assembly's response was different from all the others. The Oreth were the oldest compact signatory, 12,000 years of spacefaring history. They had fought wars before the compact existed, in a period their historians called the Expansion Era, a time they did not discuss in detail and did not encourage others to research too deeply. They had been among the primary architects of the compact 600 years ago. They had held their signature without a single formal violation for 6 centuries. Their response was not sympathetic. It was not strategic. It was something else entirely. The humans are not aberrant. They are what war is when the ceremony is removed from it. The compact holds because every signatory chose to believe, together, that it represents something universal. It does not represent something universal. It represents what 12 civilizations agreed to pretend. Not together because the alternative was looking at their own histories without the protection of that pretense. We signed the compact because we examined the expansion era and were frightened of ourselves. We recommend that you examine your own history with the same honesty. The humans cannot threaten what the compact is because the compact was never what we told each other it was. The humans have simply not agreed to participate in the story. We will not be joining a coalition to pressure them. We do not believe pressure is the relevant tool here. Oreth read this response 4 times. He drank his tea. He presented everything to the marshal and senior staff the following morning. He read the responses in order without comment. The Shen, the Thalari, 4 other civilizations, each of which contained some version of the same information. They had known about humanity, they had studied humanity, they had made decisions about humanity, and every decision had arrived at the same place. He read the Oreth response last. When he finished, the room was quiet in the particular way it gets when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Val sat without moving for nearly a full minute. "They all knew," Keth said. "Yes," Oreth said. "They knew, and none of them told us." "We never asked," Oreth said. "And I suspect they expected we would find out the same way they did, by engaging." "And how did they find out?" "The Shen had a brief border incident with a human colony years ago. They withdrew before it became a declared conflict. The Thalari modeled it. The Oreth—" He paused. The Oreth are old enough to remember what they were before the compact. I think they recognized something familiar." Val looked at him. What did they recognize? Oreth had been thinking about how to say this for 12 hours. "Marshal," he said, "we have been operating under a shared assumption, one that I held without ever questioning it, that the compact reflects a universal truth, that all intelligent species, when they have developed enough to reach the stars, naturally understand that war should have limits, that the compact did not create that understanding, but simply formalized what was already there." He paused. "The Oreth are suggesting something different. They're suggesting that the compact is not a reflection of universal values. It is a choice. Every signatory looked at its own history, saw what war actually was, and chose the ceremony because the alternative," He stopped. What is the alternative? Keth said. Looking honestly at what you are, Orith said. The room was quiet again. Then the humans, Val said slowly, are simply honest, Orith said. In a way that is very uncomfortable to be in a war with, yes. He waited. The marshal was still, thinking. Sir, Orith said, I've spent 3 weeks reading human military history. I've read their conflict records, their weapons development, their tactical and strategic writing. He placed his notes on the table. I've also read their attempts to limit themselves, the treaties, the laws of war, the agreements they made, and then broke, and then remade. He gave it a moment to settle. They built those limits themselves, he said, not because any external force required it, because they looked at what they were doing to each other and tried, imperfectly, repeatedly, never successfully enough, to make it smaller. He looked at the faces around the table. They have a body of law called international humanitarian law. They developed it across 2 centuries of formal conflict, and it has been growing ever since. They have courts specifically designed to prosecute people who violate the rules they themselves wrote. Those courts are imperfect. The rules are violated constantly. The courts keep trying. A pause. There is a document called the Geneva Conventions that has been revised and amended across multiple generations. Each revision was written in response to a specific gap that a specific war had used as a weapon. He paused again. He wanted the next sentence to land correctly. And every revision was paid for, he said. Someone died because the previous version didn't cover what happened to them. Then someone wrote it down. Then it was covered. The room held very still. Val said quietly, they built the compact to stop themselves. Yes, Orith said, from inside. A long silence. And it works, Orith said. The way anything built from the inside works. Imperfectly, under pressure, with gaps. But it holds when both sides believe in it. He paused. They simply have never fought a party who did. He gathered his notes. He was done. He had said what he came to say. The meeting dissolved without a formal decision on next steps, which had never happened before in Orth's experience of Val's command meetings. The marshal sat at the table for a while after the others left. Keth was last out, and as always, he stopped at the door. Scholar Vaughn. Orith looked up. The human courts, Keth said, the ones that prosecute compact violations, they actually prosecute their own people? Yes, Orith said, with varying degrees of success. But yes, not just the defeated side after a war. Correct. There are cases on record where victorious powers prosecuted their own commanders. Keth considered this. We don't have that, he said. No, the compact assumes it isn't necessary. It assumes that signatories will honor their agreement because they agreed. And when they don't, Keth said, there's no mechanism. There's formal censure, diplomatic pressure. The other signatories can... But there's no mechanism, Keth said again. Not a question, a recognition. No, Orith said. Keth stood in the doorway a moment longer. The humans built the mechanism, he said, because they knew they'd need it. Yes, because they had already been through the version without it. Yes, Keth nodded, once, slowly, the nod of a man who has found the answer to a question he didn't want to ask. He left. Orith sat alone in the conference room. The Orith response was still open on his data pad. The compact was never what we told each other it was. The humans have simply not agreed to participate in the story. He read it one more time. He thought about the Geneva Conventions. 3 major revisions, each one written in the blood of the gap the previous version hadn't covered. Imperfect. Ongoing. Built not from the belief that it would work perfectly, but from the refusal to stop trying. He thought about Captain Solace in the interview room saying, some of it reads like it was written to make war safe for the people who started it. He thought about Clause 9. He thought about the 40 years he had spent admiring the clean architecture of the compact, the elegance of it, the precision, the way it all fit together. And he thought about how much of that elegance came from the fact that it had never had to wrestle with what the humans had been wrestling with for 10,000 years. The compact was elegant partly because it had been written by civilizations that agreed with each other before they started writing. The humans had written their laws in the middle of the disagreement. That was the difference. Not that humanity was more violent or more dangerous or more honest in some simple way. The difference was that every word of human conflict law had been written in response to something that had already happened, to someone who had already been hurt by the gap that word was meant to close. The compact had been written in advance, by people who wanted to believe the advance was enough. Orth opened a new document. He typed a title, On the Assumption of Universality in Compact Conflict Law. He wrote the first paragraph, stopped, deleted it, started again, stopped. The truth he was trying to write kept moving when he came close to it. It didn't hold still. It required a different kind of approach. He saved the empty document and closed it. He would find the right words eventually. He suspected it was going to take a while. The peace meeting was held aboard a station called Neutral Point 11. It was a gray institutional station designed for exactly this purpose. A place where parties who had been trying to hurt each other could sit in the same room without the architecture taking sides. It had hosted 47 formal peace negotiations in its 200 years of operation. The staff were professional and quiet and had seen enough of what war produced to have no romantic ideas about it. High Marshal Sethran Val arrived with war strategist Keth, fleet scholar Orith Vaughn, and a legal team of 12. He wore his formal uniform, full decorations, the seal of honorable engagement on his left chest, and moved through the corridors of the station with the bearing of a man who had decided that whatever happened in the next several days, he would maintain his dignity throughout it. Admiral Jonah Carr arrived with 2 staff officers, yet no decorations. They met in the main corridor outside the conference room. Val was considerably taller than Carr. Carr had the kind of face that had been making fast assessments for a very long time and had stopped showing what those assessments found. Marshal, Carr said. Admiral, Val said. They went inside. The territorial and economic terms were settled in 3 days. This surprised the Vreth legal team, who had prepared for at least 2 weeks of negotiation. The humans moved through each clause the way they appeared to move through everything else, directly without ceremony, interested only in what the words meant and what they would produce. When a term was acceptable, they said so. When it wasn't, they said exactly why and offered a specific change. Val's lead negotiator reported to him after day 1 with a single word to describe the human approach: efficient. Val nodded. He had stopped being surprised by humans approximately 10 days into the conflict, which he understood to be some kind of progress. On day 4, with the main treaty terms complete, Orith Vaughn stepped forward. This was the ceremonial part. The cameras had been cleared for it. A new signatory to the compact was a significant moment. There had not been a new signature in 60 years. Orith placed the compact document on the table in front of the human delegation and formally extended the invitation. Carr took the document. He read it, carefully the way Orith had seen Solace read it in the interview room. Not skimming, not performing, actually reading. He turned to his 2 staff officers and had a brief, the quiet conversation that the cameras couldn't pick up. He turned back. We'd like 3 months to review this, he said. Of course, Orith said. His face showed nothing. He had practiced that over the past month. What he was feeling behind it was the specific, suspended stillness of a man who has been waiting for something and is now waiting for something else, and does not yet know what shape the something else will take. 3 months. The document arrived at Fleet Command on the 91st day. Vel placed it on Orith's desk and stood back with the expression of a young man who had learned over the past several months that it was better to give the scholar space when he received new information. Orith looked at it. The original compact, with all its cross-references and attached legal commentary, was a substantial document. What the humans had returned was approximately 4 times as long. He opened it. Proposed amendments to the Pan-Galactic Compact on Honorable Conflict. Human Earth Government Submission. He turned the page. The amendments began at number 1 and continued in clear and precise legal language to number 847. Orith sat down. He hadn't realized he'd been standing. He started reading. The early amendments were what he expected. Definitional clarifications, technical corrections, points where the compact's language was ambiguous or had dated poorly. Amendment 37 corrected a mathematical error in Clause 11's casualty threshold formula, a small error that Orth had privately noticed years ago, but had never bothered to formally raise. The humans had caught it. He moved into the middle amendments. They were more significant. They addressed the supply infrastructure protections. Clause 9, the clause Salas had pointed to in the interview room, the one that protected the war rather than the people. The human version didn't remove the protections, it narrowed them. Protected infrastructure now applied only to systems serving civilian populations above a specific size, with criteria laid out plainly. Military supply chains were not mentioned anywhere in the revision. Orth read this for a while. He moved to Amendment 247. It expanded the definition of protected noncombatants. The original compact's definition had been narrow. Medical staff, designated humanitarian personnel, civilians in explicitly marked zones. Practical and sufficient, honored by the standards of the civilizations that had written it. The human version was 3 pages long. It covered categories of people the original compact had simply not thought to name, or had left in the gray area between protected and not protected. Workers attached to military operations who held no weapons. Civilian contractors. People living in proximity to military positions without involvement in them. Category after category, each one defined with enough precision to hold up under pressure. The footnotes listed why each category had been added. Orth started reading the footnotes. Each entry cited a specific historical conflict, a specific year, a specific location, a specific casualty figure for the population that category was now designed to protect. Every citation was from a human war. He read them slowly. He read them all the way through. It took a long time. Someone had been in every one of those situations, fallen into every one of those gaps. Someone had survived it, or someone who knew them had survived it, and written down what the gap was and what it had cost. Then someone else had read that account and added it to the list. Then someone had read the list and written the amendment. Every line of it paid for. Every word earned the hard way. He set Amendment 247 down and sat with it for a while. Then he turned to Amendment 312. Amendment 312 was 1 page. It proposed an independent compact tribunal, a standing body with the authority to investigate formal violations, issue binding censure, and impose graduated consequences for repeated violations, weighing up to and including suspension of compact membership. The structure was detailed. The process was clear. The independence of the body from any individual signatory was built into the architecture of the thing at every level. The humans had not invented this for the compact. It was in their own legal history first, decades before they had any idea the compact existed. They had built it for themselves because they had needed it and not had it, and they knew what that looked like. They had kept it even when it was inconvenient, especially when it was inconvenient. They had prosecuted their own commanders under it, imperfectly, under enormous political pressure, with outcomes that were sometimes inadequate. But they had kept trying. Orth read Amendment 312 3 times. 600 years. 12 civilizations. No enforcement mechanism, because agreement was assumed to be enough. The humans were proposing in 1 page to fix that, not because they were idealists, because they were the opposite of idealists, because they had the specific, detailed, bloody record of what happened without it. He closed the document. He opened his own draft, the scholarly paper he had been trying to write for 3 months, the one that kept moving when he came close to the truth of it. He wrote for 4 hours without stopping. The formal signing was scheduled for the following month. The night before, Orth was in his quarters on Neutral Point 11 when a message arrived from Admiral Carr's office requesting a private meeting. That evening, if convenient. He sent back that it was. Carr arrived alone. He carried a dark bottle, which he placed on the table without introduction. "Human whiskey," he said. "I was told your people can tolerate it." "Our physiology is compatible, yes," Orth said. Carr poured 2 glasses. He sat. He had the look of a man who had been doing something difficult for a long time and was prepared to keep doing it as long as was needed. Orth sat across from him. They drank. The whiskey was smoky and sharp in a way that wasn't unpleasant, just entirely unlike anything Orth had tasted before. 847 amendments, Orth said. We had a lot to say, Carr said. Amendment 247. Carr looked at his glass. The footnotes, Orth said. Someone built that list. A lot of someone's, Carr said. Over a long time. He turned the glass in his hands. Every time the gap got used as a weapon, somebody wrote it down. Said never again. Added it to the list. A pause. Didn't always work. Kept adding to the list anyway. Orth had been carrying his question for months. He had been building toward this conversation across 12 pages of notes and 3 months of trying to write a paper that kept refusing to hold still. He asked it. Your species built the laws of war yourselves, from inside, but you've been violating them since the day you wrote them. Conflicts continue. Violations continue. He paused. Why? If you know what the laws are for, if you wrote them because you understood the cost, why does it keep happening? Carr looked at him. Not right away. He looked at his glass first, then at the small viewport and the stars on the other side of it, then at Orth. Because the alternative, he said, Weiss was looking at what we are and deciding we were fine with it. He set the glass down. We're not fine with it. We've never been fine with it. That's why we kept writing it down. Every generation, every war, kept trying to build a better fence. He paused. We fight like there isn't one until we're done. Then we look at what we did and we feel genuinely terrible about it, and we try to make sure the next fence is a little higher. Orth looked at him. Amendment 312, he said. The tribunal. Among other things, you built the enforcement mechanism because you knew you would need it. We built it because we needed it and not had it. We knew what that looked like. Marshal Vale agreed to it in principle, Orth said. He found it reasonable. Good. He also found it somewhat humbling. Carr smiled faintly. Not a triumphant smile. The smile of a man who recognizes a feeling from the inside. Yeah, he said. It usually is. They drank. Orth looked out the viewport at the dark between the stars. He thought about the 40 years he had spent studying the compact, the elegance of it, the precision, the way every clause fit neatly against the others. He had loved it the way a person loves a well-built structure, not for what it was made of, but for how it held together. He thought about Amendment 247, 3 pages of people the original compact hadn't thought to name. He thought about Amendment 312, 1 page of mechanism built from the memory of not having it. He thought about Captain Solace in the interview room saying, violation of what? Admiral, he said. Carr looked at him. Do you think it will work? The tribunal, the enforcement mechanism, the amended compact. Carr was quiet for a moment, genuinely thinking the way Solis had genuinely thought. No, he said. Orth looked at him. Not perfectly, Carr said. Nothing works perfectly, but it'll work better than nothing. And every time it fails, we'll write down how it failed and why, and we'll try to fix it. He paused. That's kind of the whole thing. Orth sat with this. He understood it. He thought he had been moving toward understanding it for months, but hearing it said plainly settled something that had been unsettled since the first night at Grid 7, when he had sat in the dark and written 4 sentences in his private log about universal laws and whether such a thing existed. Not perfection, not a clean structure that solved the problem forever. A process. Imperfect, ongoing, paid for in the specific currency of failure, and trying again, and failing differently, and still trying. The Vreth had built the compact 600 years ago and told each other it was the answer. The humans were proposing, in 847 amendments, that the answer wasn't a destination. Maybe it was just the walking. The signing took place the following morning. Orth stood at the back of the room and watched Admiral Carr add the human signature to the compact, below the 11 signatures that had been there for 6 centuries. The cameras recorded it. The arbitration staff documented it. The official record would note it as a historic moment. The first new compact signatory in 60 years, achieved in the aftermath of an armed conflict that had lasted 41 days. What the official record would not note, because official records don't capture such things, was the expression on Carr's face when he signed. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something quieter. Something that looked like a person adding their name to a list they know is imperfect, knowing it needs to be longer, knowing the longer it gets, the more chance it has of holding. Val shook Carr's hand. Keth stood at the side of the room with his long face showing nothing, watching everything. Orth watched too, and thought about the footnotes in Amendment 247 and about the 6,000 years the compact had held without an enforcement mechanism, and about the single word that had started all of this. Acknowledged. One word. And underneath it, unwritten. On the entire shape of what was coming. Not because the humans had planned it that way, but because they had been exactly who they were. And who they were was something no one in that room had been prepared for. 11 years later, Orth Van published a scholarly work that would be cited more often than any other document in compact legal scholarship for the following century. It was not his longest work. It was not his most technically complex, but it was the one scholars returned to again and again when they needed to understand the thing that had changed when the humans signed. The conclusion section was 4 paragraphs. The last paragraph read, "We arrived to teach them the rules of war." What we found instead was a species that had invented those rules themselves, from the inside, and out of self-knowledge dark enough to frighten any other civilization into comfortable fictions. We carried the compact like a shield. They carried it like a wound. I have spent a decade determining which of us understood it better. I have my answer. I do not entirely like it.